Pai hoi Ua hele mai Ua hele mai Nā tuaine
Spoke Hawaii Nui, and you are listening to Hawaiian. What is it called? Hawaiian Potpourri.
Yes.
We've had so many different kinds of programs. I've had a second glance and Hawaiian perspectives. Well, this is a Hawaiian Potpourri on radio station KWAI 1080 on your AM dial. My guest is Brother Leon Siu, and Brother Leon is half of a partnership known as Leon and Malia.
Right.
And with a song we played previously, I don't want to move too far away from our subject, but it's so interesting, the song Opai I play with Israel Kamakapipo Ole, and it's a song that you have had some involvement in, and in fact may have opened the door for Brother Israel to pick up on it. Can you tell us that history?
Yes, well, that particular song is part of a cantata that we wrote. Now, that is a traditional song, and in fact, it's based actually on some very ancient chants. And the object of the chant was to name the various creatures in the sea around by telling this story. And the story is a very intriguing story, but we wrote a cantata around that story. And it's a story that's universal. You see glimpses of that story in legends all over the world. And it really is one of redemption. It's one of how do you make up for, what do you need to do to set something pono, make it right again. So, but the song Opai refers to the self-sacrifice of the Opihi, that they sacrifice themselves in order that the young boy can go and save his sister from a mo'o. And this story actually takes place from the island of Kauai. And in Poipu area, there is a place that I can't remember the name of the place, but it has to do with a mo'o that is under the ocean. And you can hear its sighing and its breathing. And so anyway, but this ancient story comes from there. But Malia and I had included this in a symphonic cantata that we wrote from 1976 to 79. We were involved in writing this piece, and digital recording was and Malia and I were spending quite a bit of time in Los Angeles in the music industry. I was doing a lot of studio work and composing, writing for films and things like that. So in the process of all this, we became quite involved in the technical development of digital recording. And and at the same time, we were coming back here quite frequently to perform parts of this cantata with the Honolulu Symphony. So eventually we got a record company in Los Angeles who was interested in producing a digital recording of a Hawaiian symphonic piece. And here we were. And so we actually recorded it in London with the London Symphony Orchestra.
Wow.
And so one of the climactic, or one of the central pieces in this music, it's an hour-long cantata, but one of the central pieces is this ancient Hawaiian song, Opai. And so we recorded it then, of course, in this full orchestral setting. It's really quite huge. It's a very dramatic piece.
How is it possible for us to hear it?
Actually, if you go to Google and you look for a recording called "Boy with Goldfish,"
Okay, Boy with Goldfish. Okay.
And you should be able to find it on Amazon.
Okay.
The funny thing is that when we recorded it, it was before there was any way to play back digital recordings.
Oh, so because it was too advanced.
There were no
technology.
CDs. Yeah. So it took about 6 years later before a CD appeared, and then we were able to actually issue it on CD.
Oh, wow. And in the meantime, we had DAT players, digital audio tapes.
Right.
Were they being played in that format?
No, because actually CDs came out before the DATs.
I see.
Yeah, because the CDs were, of course, manufactured, stamped. You couldn't actually record onto a CD disc at the time. So that's where the tapes that you could
I
record
see.
onto in digital format.
Right, right. Well, I'm anxious to hear it. And how do I get permission to play it?
Just ask me.
Okay, can we play it?
Sure. Okay.
I really appreciate your explanation of it. I've listened to the words about the puhi and covering of the eyes but I like that explanation that you had just given us. All right, and my apologies for taking or meandering too far from our main purpose here. You're talking about the developments in international affairs. So can you bring us up to date?
Okay.
Before you do, if I may comment on the special rapporteur being Jim Anaya, and he is from the United States, a citizen of the United States. I forget what Indian tribe he comes from, but among very close to the Pueblos, I believe. Before him, there was an earlier rapporteur who was from Cuba, Miguel Alfonso Martinez.
Yes.
And because of his Cuban nationality, and I had invited him to Hawaii to do his study partly in Hawaii, and he was very anxious to do it. And during that time, Clinton had just signed the apology, or the confession and apology, in 1993. And so I took it to Geneva and introduced it at the special committee, or I forget the name of
treaties.
the working group,
Yeah.
the working
Oh, the
group
working
on
group,
indigenous populations. So Miguel came running up to me and he said, "Is this true? Is this really true?" And then he was very excited. He wanted to come. He applied to come as a UN official. The United States stopped him from coming. And so there's a lot of tricks that the U.S. will play in order to prevent criticism of the United States itself. But it was very good that Jim, or actually Dr. James Anaya.
Going back to Miguel Alfonso Martinez, and that he actually got back at him because he included Hawaii as a prominent part in his report on treaties and other constructive arrangements.
Right.
Yeah. Which is right now being reopened as far as a discussion on it, and our friend Alfred Desaias is going to be working. They're trying to get this particular study into Alfred Desaias' hands as a expert, independent expert.
And all of this comes about because we have had some of our people going and participating in these activities, while many others had no clue what was going on or why we were going and why we were wasting our effort and monies. At a time, I was a trustee with the Office of Hawaiian Affairs, and my whole campaign was to bring Hawaii one step closer to Hawaiian independence. Other trustees could appreciate this position, as well as my going to Australia, to Panama, to the UN and the rest. And I think, and in fact, Brother Keale, he was also trustee with me before he died. He says, Poka, I understand now what you have been trying to do. And had I had that understanding at that time that I have now, I would have supported you. But he had been very much against and critical of this kinds of stuff. So I think at times people themselves mature into a fuller understanding and appreciation. So we must continue with the work.
And remember not to burn bridges.
Yeah.
and so we just treat it with aloha, and eventually things come around. And really that was the Queen's philosophy. She didn't force anything, and just simply said, okay, well, if not now, then we this is how we're going to do it, because eventually it will resolve in our favor.
Because the longer view is that we're going to have to live with one another even after the nation is restored or revived or created. And at that time, based on or if we had burned bridges, then it's going to carry over into that new society that we form, and you don't want to have those struggles just merely postponed. Or what do some people call it? Kicking the can down the road?
Yeah.
No. Pick up the can now. Take care of it.
Yes.
Go ahead.
So what's going on right now is that we've had a petition before one of the committees in the under the Human Rights Council, and that particular petition we've been trying to get moving into another level. And so the last two meetings, actually the last three meetings I've had in Geneva with this particular committee, the CERD committee, Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, has been very encouraging in that they have turned the corner and said, okay, we will be able to help you. We can do what little we can do, we will do. And that little is that they will refer our petition to the next level, which is in the General Assembly. And the General Assembly, as I said, is the one that handles political issues. So it'll now come out of the indigenous realm and move more into the political realm, which is what happened to Hawaii that made it become a state. The process in getting it from this committee in Geneva into the General Assembly is a bit complex, but it's still a great sign that they're willing to move it there. Now, if this committee is successful in getting the committee in New York at the General Assembly to accept our request, then it sets up a whole new paradigm for us, because it means that the General Assembly will now take a look at the facts and the conditions that occurred in 1959 when Hawaii was incorporated as a state. And by doing so, it brings the question right to the forefront about whether or not Hawaii still should be on the list of non-self-governing territories, as it was in 1959. And we believe that it should be, because there was fraud involved in the U.S. reporting to the United Nations in 1959 that Hawaii had chosen to become incorporated into the United States. So the moment the question arises, it really will be a self-answering question, because you can simply go to the procedures and show the violations. So in other words, the moment the question is opened, the conclusion is drawn. And the conclusion,
because the record is already there.
Right, the record is there. And the conclusion then puts Hawaii, removes it, or actually, let's say,
reinscribe?
Pardon me?
No,
Yeah, it
sorry,
reinscribes Hawaii on the list of non-self-governing territories in the United Nations. But at the moment, that means that Hawaii would be in line for decolonization. Now, what we know now, as opposed to what we knew in 1959 and 1960, namely that the Hawaiian Kingdom still exists, that we still are a lawful entity, we still are an internationally recognized sovereign nation, that means that they would not be reinscribing us as an
occupied
territory. We actually, the only way that they can see us is as a nation that's already in existence. And so the whole thing triggers quite rapidly, at least through these legal procedures, to identifying Hawaii as an independent nation. And at that point, it's just a matter of how do we reclaim or
establish our governing entity.
Exactly, And then at that point, my belief is that then that's when we can kick in Keanu Sai's proposal, which is invoke the laws of occupation and say that the occupier needs to assist us into developing our mechanisms to be self-governing. It becomes so. It actually puts us on a fast track if we can get over this one hurdle.
Yeah, yeah.
But we also have to be careful because it can also backfire if we try to force an issue and then the United Nations is not prepared to work with it. Then it could backfire and it would be very difficult to bring the issue up again in the near future. Yeah.
Well, one of the points or possibilities of backfiring is the American objection, the same as a French objection. And the objection has been that once a country has been taken off of the list of places to be decolonized, because we're talking about the mechanism of the Special Committee on Decolonization. Sometimes they call it the Committee on 24. And so the U.S. claim, as well as the French claim, and the British will go along with it, that once taken off the list, you cannot get back on the list of places to be decolonized. And if they win the day on that argument, then that's one of the points of backfiring. And as we look at other countries who had been on the list, taken off, and then try to get on again, we can look at some success with regards to New Caledonia or Kanaki, and its the essential question was placed. The other one would have been Puerto Rico.
Yes.
Because the U.S. has been screaming and kicking and saying, no, you're not going to reopen that question because you took them off of the list in 1953. And so you cannot put them back on. Generally, what is the current view with regards to the right of being reinscribed?
Yeah, I think it's very favorable. The problem that going back to Puerto Rico, for instance, in 1998, they actually went through an election for decolonization. So even though the United States insists that Puerto Rico is a commonwealth of the United States, they still are allowing Puerto Rico, the United States still allowing Puerto Rico the decolonization process. And they're going through that again this year. In fact, this November, they'll be having another vote. Puerto Ricans have essentially usually voted to stay.
But at least the question of independence, previously not put on the ballot, is at least being
now on. Yeah. And then there are 3 other territories that the United States is currently preparing for decolonization, and that's American Samoa, Guam, and U.S. Virgin Islands. All are going through the educational process, including the possibility for independence. So there's actually a pretty active debates going on in these different countries, and we don't know how they will turn out, but at least the options are being offered, and there's an educational process. But the re-enlisting of New Caledonia is very significant because this is one, and from the French too. And so I think that the tactic of keeping countries from being re-enlisted is now fallen out of favor. The biggest problem we have now is that these countries, France and the U.S. and others that still have colonies, have taken to a different tactic, and that is to try to slow down the process, particularly with the Decolonization Committee, to the point where the Decol Committee is practically non-functioning. I mean, they still meet once a year, but they're very reticent to take on any new cases or any new endeavors. So there are still 16 other nations or peoples and nations listed on the list of for decolonization, but there's very little movement going on amongst those.
About 10 years ago, the United States wanted to kill the committee, saying that there's no other places that is under non-self-governing territory.
Mission accomplished.
But the General Assembly wouldn't buy that. How do you distinguish between the General Assembly and the Security Council? Because we oftentimes hear of how the U.S. can just veto the whole subject and get it off the map.
Fortunately for us, that as we were talking earlier, the General Assembly consists of 142 nations that were decolonized. They had to go through the process over the last 50 years, 60 years. So really, we have a tremendous amount of empathy for our situation. The other thing is that they actually are not done decolonization yet. France, for instance, is facing Tahiti. Tahiti has been pushing and pushing to the point where now they've gotten the support of the Melanesian Spearhead Group and the Pacific Islands Forum and others pushing for that. There's also Western Sahara and some other countries that have been pushing quite actively. So decolonization is still, it won't go away soon. I think that the Tahiti situation is one that's going to really challenge France. Now, France is actually making noise that they would not mind releasing Tahiti. 2 or 3 years ago, Sarkozy actually said that because they were under. Tahiti is a dependent, is a dependent state of France, and France is just saying we don't have the money to support an outpost like this or a colony, and so there's some real strong economic incentives for France to release Tahiti. And as I said, and Tahiti itself is building its political movement.
Right. Because now it seems to be 50-50 in terms of the votes. Candidates for independence as opposed to candidates to remain with Tahiti. I note that we only have about 2.5 minutes more. I think one of the big differences when one looks at the United Nations and looks at the Security Council and the General Assembly is that the issue of self-determination, the issue of non-self-governing territories, of decolonization is within the province of the General Assembly, not the Security Council. And as a result, the U.S. and France and Britain and any other country with veto power cannot step in and veto the subject matter. And
that's right.
And so we're at least safe from that, because otherwise the U.S. would just come in and veto the
Under the General Assembly, it's majority rule. And like I said, 3/4 of the General Assembly all came out of the decolonization process. So most likely they will support us. And there's a lot of, nuances to all of this too, but we don't have enough time to go into it. But generally speaking, if we can get this into the General Assembly, then we've made it over the main hurdle and we're just really ready to trigger the restoration of Hawaii as an independent nation.
And then the struggle begins at home. With the education and the building of this dream.
And that's where we need time. We don't want to become an independent nation immediately. We want it to be said, yes, we are an independent nation, and we have this 10 years to accomplish this changeover, or something, or 5 years, whatever. And we take the time to provide education and a vision for our people, because I think our people will get really excited to know
to vision independence, being away from the shenanigans of the United States. I'm very sorry we got to go to news, if the news will be on. Thank you very much for joining us, and come back again.
Mahalo.
Mahalo.
Kaulana na pua o Hawaii, Kupa ama hope o ka aina, Iki mai ka elele o ka loko ino, Pala pala anunu me ka paka. Ane mai Hawaii moku o ke ave, Koku ana honoa o Pi'ilani, Ka ko'o mai kaua I o mano, Pa'apu me ke oni o ka kuhi hewa. pu'u ka